Well, just the other day, we received a new federal budget, and the question is, will it do the job? Namely, supercharge our economy and get Canada moving again. That is the question we're going to talk about with Dr. Jack Mintz. Well, Dr. Jack Mintz, I believe, is certainly one of the most respected economic voices in the country, but he's more than that. I would say he's a kind of a doctor that can really weigh in on the state of the nation. Because today we're going to talk about not just simply the economy, but the interrelationship between governance, our institutions, and even our culture, as we know that they're all interconnected and they make up our standard of living and, in fact, our future for our country. So, Jack, it's a pleasure to see you. I'm so glad that we could meet like this. I know that you've done a lot of things, including you chaired the 1996 panel on tax reform, as I recall. You've also been the former president of the CD Howe Institute. You're an economist at the University of Calgary and an all around nice guy. So, warm welcome, Jack.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, Jack, we've got a lot to talk about, and I want to start off with a little bit around vision because I know that we've talked about this before, but obviously Canada's an incredibly blessed country. I mean, we've got everything arguably going for us, including natural resources A to Z, from coast to coast to coast. We've got an incredible people and geography. Would you agree in principle that Canada should be, well, quite frankly, the most prosperous free nation in this planet?
Well, I'm not sure about the most prosperous because I've never really studied that issue to see what would make you the most prosperous. I mean, Luxembourg right now is one of the most prosperous, and Ireland, but whether Canada could get to those levels is another issue. But there's no question that we have been blessed with natural resource bounty that very few countries have had so much. And I think the other important thing is that we've actually done a very good job with our human resources.
Yes.
Relatively well educated and skilled, so that we could take advantage of that huge comparative advantage when it comes to the resource sector. So
Exactly.
certainly we can do extremely well. And I guess if we're getting into it, I think lately it's been a big disappointment in terms of what we've been able to, or what we could potentially achieve.
Well, so to put it bluntly, we've got everything going for us, including people and a lot else, but we kind of need a remake. And so I want to start off with really a kind of a basic question, Jack, and that is the mood of the country. And I just noticed a Abacus poll. It just came out at the tail end of October that said that two-thirds of Canadians are living with a profound sense of precarity, or if I understood that term precarity, is really feeling like they're living on the edge, barely making it. Does that surprise you?
Well, I think it's not necessarily surprising, but let me, if you look at Canada's situation, the past decade, we've had such poor economic growth
Hmm.
that it means that people can't earn as much income when things are not percolating as much in the economy. And of course, Europe has been facing similar issues, and as a result, there's many people in those countries that have found the much higher inflation after the pandemic was a real stretch in their budgets because that inflation was rising much more quickly than their real incomes were rising. And in fact, I have done this work and used it in the past, which I have shown that uh, the Canada's per capita growth in GDP from 2015 to 2023, 24 has been virtually zero, a little bit positive, but virtually zero, which is actually worse than the European countries, uh, which have been generally more in the 5 to 6% range cumulatively over that period. The U.S. has been much stronger in growth over the past decade. They've grown about 17%,
Would that be
Well,
this slide right here on economic growth here that illustrates the point that you're making, Jack? So we've got Canada here at really quite a low figure here. It's the very top there of very low economic growth in the US, more towards 20% over the last 10 years. So
right.
what does this tell you, Jack? Is this explains why Canadians, you would say, are feeling precarious in their situation?
Well, right, because when you start seeing the kind of inflation that we had after the pandemic, people's incomes haven't been able to keep up. Unless you were doing very well in the stock market, where some people have done, but that's not for the general population. And so, as a result, people have been finding that it's more difficult to deal with necessities of life. Being able to feed their children and themselves with
Exactly.
food and being able to afford housing. And we also know that Canada's also has had one of the worst records in housing prices amongst the OECD countries over the past number of years. So was Australia and a couple of other countries. But we've had a very fast rise in housing prices, particularly in the large urban centers, which have been heavily affected. And that's been another problem for people if they have higher rents to pay, or if they're just young and they're just coming into the housing market. They're facing a lot of difficulty in being able to afford a home.
So in this, well, precarious situation, you can see how the government really has, I would argue, because of bad economic choices, bad policy decisions, Canadians are really in a difficult spot in terms of their standard of living. So we want to go through a little bit around the state of the nation. Um, so we've talked about growth, low growth. What about debt? I mean, what is Canada's situation in a nutshell? Are we are we in a precarious situation there as well?
Well, actually, the International Monetary Fund publishes quite frequently debt of various countries, and it looks at actually the total amount of debt, not just government debt, but also corporate debt and household debt. Canadians have been particularly stretched on the debt side, which is a bit unusual because when you think of Canada, we don't allow mortgage interest deductibility like United States and some European countries, and people tend to lever up their homes in order to take advantage of that interest deduction and use that money to invest elsewhere. And so I think that's one surprising factor is how much our household debt has been taken on. Our corporate debt has not been too bad as a country relative to other countries, although recently it's gone up. And then, of course, our government debt. It depends which number you want to use, but it has been escalating. We've been in a better position compared to, let's say, the United States right now, and some other countries. But certainly our gross debt now, public debt, is 110% of GDP, according to the IMF statistics. And the only thing the IMF leaves out deficits that are in government employee pension plans. So that's not included in that measure. And
Okay,
so
so if
that
if
is a
if you
that
look
is a
at
very
that,
big concern when you think about it.
okay, so why is it a big concern, Jack? And I just want to explain this to understand this. When you say 110% the size of our GDP, the GDP is the size of our economy, so it's 110% larger than our economy. Why should we be concerned? Why does that raise an alarm bell with you?
Well, it raises a alarm bell for two reasons. First of all, we actually have a term structure for a debt that's shorter than a number of countries. And so we have to go out to the market, international markets particularly, to raise debt. Now, because there's a lot of confidence in Canadian debt right now, we're not having trouble funding that debt. However, when you start growing your debt too much and people start getting concerned about your ability to pay that debt, as would happen to Canada back in the early 1990s, when we actually had trouble trying to sell our debt to the international market, and almost had to go to the IMF to get a bailout, which is unheard of for a G7 country. That I think is a concern that we always have to keep in mind, that we don't want to get back into that position.
Right
And the
on.
second
Yeah.
issue, of course, is in order to service that debt, we have to pay interest on it. And of course, those public debt charges can really start ramping up. And in fact, they are now getting to be the size of more than what we spend on some things like hospitals or defense, and et cetera. So public debt charges start squeezing out the amount of money that we have available for governments to spend on, or at least to cut taxes as an option. And so we have to be concerned about not going overboard in debt. Now, right now, we seem to have fiscal room to take on debt, but as we keep using up our fiscal room, there's going to be some point where there'll be a financial crisis, or something serious happens, and then all of a sudden we jump into even higher levels of debt, and governments are going to be facing some real more and more significant problems. We're not like the United States, for example. The U.S. is a reserve currency for the international world, and unfortunately, that kind of is, I think, maybe allayed concerns by politicians about the huge deficits right now of the U.S. government, and really the lack of fiscal sustainability right now in the United States. But a lot of the politicians believe, well, don't worry about it. No one's going to take a run at the U.S. dollar because we're a reserve currency. Everybody needs to transact in our currency. Well,
Right.
that's true to a large extent. It's still responsible for over 50% of transactions in the world, the U.S. dollar. But again, there's going to be a reckoning in financial markets if the U.S. government doesn't get serious about their deficit. And of course, if they ever do get into a serious problem, that's going to have a huge spillover effect on Canada that we have
Oh,
to
very
remember
good
too.
point. Yeah. So by reserve currency, you mean the common currency that's used in the world for transactions, much like the British pound, say 2 generations ago, was kind of the reserve currency. It can all come and go. Like it doesn't, just because it's the reserve currency is the American currency today, doesn't mean it will always be that way. And if it did change, then it could have massive impacts on Canada. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and that's because in Canada we depend so much on the U.S. economy.
Hmm.
With 33% of our, 75% of our exports going to the United States, and our exports are to the whole world are roughly 33% of Canada's GDP. So when you look at that, a significant part of our GDP, around 23-24%, is trade with the United States. And so even with the tariff issues that we're facing right now, and that's a whole other set of issues we could talk about. But even with the trade issues that we're facing now, we're still very dependent on the U.S. and we're still going to be, I think, in the future,
For
very
sure.
dependent on the U.S. Part of it is because we're so connected, both economically and culturally, with the United States. Many of us have family that are in the United States. We go to the United States for the winter to get away from from the Canadian cold weather, and so I think it's not unusual that relationship, even during this testy times right now, will likely continue for years to come.
Right. Okay, so we've had kind of a sweeping overview of kind of the state of the economy. We're clearly a nation in decline. Would that be a fair comment, Jack?
I would say that we are certainly slipping behind every others. So if you wanted to define decline in that way, yes, that's the case because
Okay.
even there's been forecasts that in 20 years' time, Canada will have have one of the lowest GDP per capita amongst OECD
Yeah.
countries. So I think
No,
if we
it's pretty
continue
stunning.
doing what
So
we're doing,
so we need to open our eyes and realize that the stats show from backwards to forward. I mean, we could have gone through dozens and dozens of other statistics to illustrate this state of decline. But the point is, we're in November 2025, Jack, as you know, and we've seen the budget just tabled literally the other day. And there's been a lot of talk about this being an investment budget, a bold budget that will really move forward a generation. And here's a clip from the finance minister himself describing this.
Minister, in this budget, you substantially increased the size of the deficit and debt load based on a pitch that you will catalyze $500 billion in additional private investment in this country over the next 5 years. How do you know that will happen?
Well, first of all, it's not how much you buy or borrow, but why. And I think that's really the question that this budget answers, because people understand now better the difference between expense and investment. This is an investment budget. So the money that is going to be borrowed, you saw that in 28, 29, we're going to be matching our operating expenses with our revenues. So what you will see after these years is really investment in the Canadian economy. And why I believe in that, just take the example of a mine. So think about the last mile and the first mile and last mile tax credit we have offered, for example, or the one for critical mineral. Well, if you do these kind of things, you're enabling, obviously, private investment. I would say Canada will be the most competitive jurisdiction on a tax basis, probably of the OECD. And then you would catalyze it by the province, by the municipality, and obviously, first and foremost, the private sector. So this is really to supercharge growth. You know, you've seen the super deduction we've done for people who want to invest in plant and equipment, in technology, in building. I mean, we're addressing the productivity and competitiveness challenge that this country has been facing for a very long time. So that's why I think this is an investment budget, and the way for us to grow our economy is to invest and to provide the incentives in order for the private sector to bring and to have these investments in our country.
And I do take that point.
Okay, so there you have a kind of a plumb line that the Minister of Finance articulated there, that this is truly an investment budget, Jack, and that we are going to, quote, supercharge the economy. Do you think this budget will do the trick?
Unclear. In fact, I was a bit surprised by some of the comments made by the minister about not knowing or making some errors in some of his points that he raised. Let me talk about, how do you achieve growth? And I think investment, is obviously important. I think everyone would agree with that. And I will say that at least this government currently is talking about investment and trying to carry out policies with a focus on economic growth, unlike the Trudeau government, which was much more concerned about redistribution and bringing in new social programs. So I think, in that sense, I think there's been a change in focus, and I think that's for the better. However, there are different ways of trying to grow the economy. You could take the view of a country like, a number of countries that I've worked in, but over the years, but who have taken the view that, it's very important for governments to carry out tax reforms, regulatory reforms in other words, for getting governments out of the way of investment, and to let the private sector kind of determine where to allocate capital to its most profitable use, and that would actually create the most GDP that we could have in the country. And certainly the United States is a really good example of that. I mean, you look at what has happened in terms of the growth of artificial intelligence and even electric vehicles and other innovations that have grown in the United States. It's come from a very dynamic private sector. Sure, there may have been some subsidies here and there thrown at them, by the U.S. government, but in general, it's often the private sector in the U.S. grows despite the government, because of the government.
Exactly. Yes.
Which is just amazing. I find about the American economy. In Canada, historically, it's almost like we can't have growth unless the government is giving a handout, or trying to protect the industry, like supply management. But it's also true. Like, even you go back to the start of Confederation, it was the national policy of John A. Macdonald about building the Canadian Pacific Railway. It wasn't a private sector saying we're going to build the railway on our own. And that was happening in the United States and Europe a lot. They didn't need the government to give subsidies. They just went ahead and built railways. And it's the same thing today. We seem to have, except for Alberta and maybe the West, there's an attitude that we can't do anything unless we have more subsidies. In fact, I found that when I was chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Recovery Council during the pandemic and just afterwards. I had to meet with all the roundtables, all the industries at roundtables in Alberta. And I was amazed. The comment was, don't give us more money. We're not looking for that. What we want is for the government to get out of the way, a change in this regulation or maybe having some important infrastructure like that governments provide, like irrigation and things like that. So it was a very different attitude, by the way, when I was involved in a similar exercise in Ontario, where there the constant plea was the government needs to provide this subsidy, the government needs to do that, et cetera, et cetera. So we've become very dependent on governments in Canada generally to direct where capital is, and that's what this budget fits in. It's a budget in which the government is directing growth. We're picking the winners. Certain types of companies, and they have to be in clean growth. They have to be in clean manufacturing. They have to be in artificial intelligence. But because we believe that growth isn't going to come from the other sectors. But if you take the attitude that you just want to get out of the way, then you're saying to the private sector, well, you move ahead and you achieve growth. And by the way, we really don't know which sector is going to grow the most, because who knows how the economy evolves over time.
Exactly.
We're not God. So it's a very different approach to budget making. And that's why I think this budget is very much akin to central planning, as opposed to really spurring entrepreneurship, which is what we need the most in Canada, is having an entrepreneurial class.
So this is a seminal moment in this nation's history where we can either continue to decline or we can be bold and transformational and open up and free the entrepreneurial capital of this incredible country. And we've got the money, but as long as government is going to be in the way, we're going to continue to put the brakes on growth and opportunity. Is that what you're getting at, Jack?
Well, that is what I'm getting at. And we know the governments aren't very good at picking winners and losers all the time. In fact, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. In fact, many times they don't. Just look at the there's a graveyard of boondoggles over history, both at federal and provincial levels, of subsidizing certain industries or certain companies, and of course it completely fails. And so that's why, if you ask me, is this a transformational budget? I don't think so. In fact, it's just governments doing what they always do, throw out money.
It's still tinkering around the edges when, in fact, we need bold moves.
As I published today, it's kind of like an investment banker's approach to running a government, where I'm just going to put a portfolio together and I'm going to pick all the securities that are or projects that are going to get funded. And I think that's going to be, to me, I think that's not changing the attitude that we've had historically for many years.
Wow. So it's fascinating. When you look at this country, you would think our ACE card, we've got a number of ACE cards, and one of them would be just the whole area of natural resources, from oil, gas, fisheries, mining, forestry, agriculture, you name it. And so if you look at oil and gas, I would have thought that we would be, if we want to really supercharge growth, and this is a question, how do we do that? Wouldn't we be shedding all those policies from the Trudeau era that gets rid of this net zero obsession, this, like tanker bans on the West Coast there's just a myriad of really bad policies that basically ward off any private sector investment for that industry. Isn't that our ACE card? Why are we not playing it?
Well, I think there's a different attitude by the Prime Minister and reflected, even said in the budget, that the future of the world is going to be net zero and clean technologies. And so therefore, we should be moving in that direction.
Hmm.
There's no proof to that statement. In fact, recently we just saw this past week Bill Gates, who believed that we
Yeah,
had a
right.
climate crisis and we're going to have to deal
Hmm.
with it, has changed his tune. And I actually have always taken the view, yes, there's issues about rising temperatures and whatever reasons that might happen. There's certain different views, uh, but even if there is concern about dealing with some of this, the question is trying to change everyone's behavior may be less efficient than actually just adaptation.
Yeah,
Because there are
of
actually some
course.
positive aspects to higher temperatures. So,
Yeah.
so Bill Gates is basically saying, look, we're pouring all this money into
Hmm.
reducing emissions when we could be actually spending money to improve the lives of people. And,
Exactly.
and and I think there's a real serious question whether net zero by 2050 will ever happen. Even some countries are now believing well, we already have China and India saying they're not going to be net zero by 2050. So we know that
Yeah.
already. And that's
Exactly.
a huge chunk of emissions in the world. And so if, and I saw recently, I forget which country it was saying probably we'll be lucky if we get net zero by 2090. So, so I think there's starting to be a reevaluation of some of the things that we thought were
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. So let's have a real conversation about that. But we need clear signals that the government doesn't want to be the problem. It wants to get out of the way. And I think you're right. This budget doesn't seem to do that. So on another front, I mean, we know that we've got a low growth economy. It's quite low. We know that we're very dependent on the United States in terms of trade, and that's both an opportunity and a threat. But we also know that our size of government is quite large. I believe if we look at total amount of government right now, it represents some 44% of our economy. Is that a concern, Jack?
Yes, it is because governments end up drawing a lot of resources away from the private sector and can therefore impede growth as well. And that number, 44%, is pretty high. Uh, in fact, if you go back even just 15 years ago, it was more like 38% of our
Wow. I
GDP,
never realized
36%.
it was quite that difference, even
Yeah,
in the last
so
15
we've had
years.
quite an expansion in government at federal, provincial, and municipal levels in the past 10 years. And it's not a matter that we're fighting a war. And so governments often end up taking up a lot of resources when a war happens. Uh,
Mhm.
in fact, we haven't had that kind of pressure. In fact, we hardly have spent any money on defense anyway as a country.
Yeah.
Less than 2% of our GDP, more like 1.3% of our GDP. So it's not because of defense that our governments are spending so much money, which has been the typical thing over the centuries. But instead, it's been simply an expansion of government spending on various social programs, particularly, and so that has led, I think, to governments becoming very big size. Now, there's some countries that have even bigger governments and relative to their economy, and that may be the decisions people want to have, just like in Canada.
Mhm.
But then there are some that have governments that are much slimmer, and in fact, some of them are very fast-growing countries that have smaller
Mhm.
governments. A good example being Ireland, but there's
Mhm.
other ones that I could mention, including the United States, where U.S. government spending is less than 40% of GDP, more in the 35 to 38% range, I think, recently. But again, these are issues that we have to worry about because governments aren't necessarily spending money wisely all the time, as we've seen.
Exactly.
In fact, there's a significant cost even to run various programs, including the public service that is needed to operate them. And so I've always been of the view that governments have to be a certain size. I mean, if you go back in the history of Canada, back in the 1960s, which we were a pretty good country at that point, we introduced a number of our social programs, but government was only a third of the economy. And there's been some studies that have suggested that that's kind of like the optimal size of government. So when you're at 44%, you're probably beyond that optimal size.
Wow. So you don't want too small a government and you don't want too big a government. You want enough air to breathe so you can have people flourish and do lots of business. And speaking of business, I know that we've heard for quite some time. I think of Carolyn Rogers, the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, talking. What was it, some year and a half ago, that we need to break the glass because we've got a major productivity problem in this country. Do we have a productivity problem, Jack?
Oh, absolutely. So let's define what productivity is for, to make sure we
Yeah.
understand what we're talking about, because there's actually different ways of measuring it. But basically, productivity is what you could produce with the labor, capital, and natural resources that you have. And if you have good productivity, you can produce more relative to that. And when you do produce more, that means you can afford paying more wages to workers and a higher return to landowners, etc. And so it's very important to have good productivity. And our productivity, depending on how you want to measure it, some people measure what's called labor productivity, which is the amount you produce for every working hour. And that has been slipping in Canada by over the decades, and it's now down to almost 0% recently. Uh,
Zero
but
percent.
yes, but it's been much higher. Like more like 2% 30 years ago. Uh, Now, if you look at some countries, they have productivity rates that are far better than Canada, labor productivity rates, and that includes countries like Ireland, as I mentioned.
Hmm.
But even U.S. productivity has been far better than Canada, which is one reason why the U.S. The average incomes in the U.S. are now moving ahead much faster than Canada is because they've had better productivity. There is another way of measuring productivity. We don't need to get into it deeply, but
Mhm.
it's called total factor productivity, where you look at how much output you produce relative to all the factors of production, labor, capital, etc., that you use. Even if you do calculate that number, it's the same story in
Mhm.
terms of our poor
Wow.
productivity performance.
So to put it bluntly, though, why should we care about productivity? I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think of productivity, think, well, how dare you, Jack? I don't want to work harder. I just want to do better. Why does productivity matter to a Canadian?
Well, actually, it's the opposite. If you have good productivity and you can produce more output with the labor you have, it also you can also produce the
Mhm.
same input
Right.
output with less labor. So in other words, people can have more leisure, and that's
Ah,
because they're getting higher incomes, and they
okay.
can spend more time, going skiing, or out with their
Mhm.
families for picnics,
Yeah.
or going to movies, or whatever.
Right. So,
So
but
you
this
end
is
up
the
getting
Canadian dream,
more
right?
time
So
available.
if we have good policy, we've got good productivity, we've got all the cylinders all firing. That's where you have the standard of living, and it circles back to our initial question around vision. Like we should be the wealthiest nation in the world. We should be like the Switzerland of North America, whatever you want to call it. That's what you're getting at, Jack, right? Like these things all add up and create a dynamic country or not.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that's why things like when we talk about per capita GDP, the growth of that. When you talk about productivity, which is just another way of getting at growth in incomes, it all
Yeah.
comes down to our standard of living. And so, if you have a strong economy,
Hmm.
then you can afford the things that you want to have, including for governments
Hmm.
raising the money that's needed for social programs. I've worked in a
Exactly.
lot of
Yeah.
over the years with the World Bank and IMF in many poor countries, and I could tell you it's the countries that are poor are the ones that don't have the same kind of social
Yeah.
programs that you would find in the rich countries. In terms of great health care,
Hmm.
education, and other institutions, and their people are also have a lower level of income, can't afford food in the same way, uh, and as a result suffer. In fact, I'll never forget. I worked in one of the things I did was work in tax reform in Bulgaria back in the late 1990s, and Bulgaria went through a very severe
Hmm.
financial crisis, which they had to fix their budget, which is one of the reasons I went out on one particular mission. But I'll never forget the first day. I was with my colleagues on this trip, and I was watching. It was a work day, and I was watching this kid going through garbage of a, I don't know if it was McDonald's we went to, but some place for lunch, and he was picking out the garbage and things like that. And apparently, a lot of kids weren't going to school because the families needed some money, and so he was picking out things like bottles and other things that he could put together and sell so that they can have some money. But in the meantime, he wasn't going to school, and those are the kinds of things that really break down when you are a poor country. Now, I should say Bulgaria really improved itself after that point, after going through that crisis, and actually was doing much better even just 5 years later.
Wow. So those are very important lessons. And Jack, I like the way you connect the dots between the world of economics and people. Like this matters to people in terms of whether you have a standard of living or a hope, or dare I say, the Canadian dream. And so this is the spirit in which we're having this conversation. So I think a related question here is, quite frankly, is Canadian is Canada is it frankly a place to do business? And I look at the numbers and the stats around business investment in this country, and it's very disturbing because the other, and I want to do this in two ways. One is to reference the larger pictures of capital outflow. Like we've all seen that slide over the years showing the incredible amount of money that's left this country since 1990 net, right? Like we have more money that's leaving the country. And then the paltry amount of money that businesses invest in improving their businesses so we actually have better productivity. Help us understand the significance of that reality, that dynamic of the Canadian economy, that we're not a magnet for capital. We're actually repelling money. Am I on target here?
80%. It's not a matter of not being able to attract capital from abroad, but it's also your own people taking their money and investing elsewhere. So there's two
Oh,
parts, and so let me try to first kind of give you some numbers, and then let me put it in some practical sense. So first of all, something I reported last week in one of my articles. I did a little calculation on capital outflows for Canada over the past several years, and then compared that to an earlier period. Since 2021, we've had a net outflow of capital that's $250 billion more than it was before the pandemic. In other words, there's been a huge exit of capital going to other countries, particularly United States, which gets to the point that I want to mention, and that is when you talk to business leaders and companies in terms of what they're doing, and I've had a few conversations just on this in the past couple of weeks. There is a lot of capital leaving Canada, and it's Canadians investing abroad.
wow.
So, for example, I spoke to a very large company, a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm not going to mention names, but it's in the manufacturing area. They said, look, we can't wait for tariffs to be decided. We can't wait for a negotiation. We have to start making some capital allocations, and we've become convinced that tariffs are going to be here for a long time, and so we're going to have to risk manage around that. So they've decided they already have a lot of U.S. operations. So now they're going to, because of the growth in the United States, they've decided that they're going to put more money into the United States and rather than in Canada. I had a discussion with a smaller company, much smaller company that exports some manufactured product down to the United States. They don't have any processing done in the United States. They do it from Canada. And they told me, well, the inputs aren't more expensive, so that's not been our problem. He said, but the U.S. tariffs are a significant problem. And so what they now, I asked, well, if that's such a problem, then, are you thinking about putting processing in the United States and rather than doing it in Canada? And he said, that's exactly what we're doing. In fact, I just signed an agreement the other day to start up a new factory in the United States. So I've been hearing a lot, manufacturing companies, because of the tariff issue, are looking to put more money into the United States. The resource sector is interestingly quite different. It's not the tariffs problem for them, but it's the regulatory problems. And so there's a lot of capital that's going down to the United States by resource companies because they feel that it's easier to produce. For example, oil and gas is now being very welcomed in the United States. Well, it isn't welcomed in Canada, and so there's a lot of capital flying down to the United States rather than staying in Canada. So I can go through a number of examples like that, but when you start going industry by industry by industry, even some industries that have a protected market in Canada are putting more money into the United States and other countries because they feel there's better growth available to them. And so I think this is an issue.
But Jack, you don't hear this story very often among Canadians, and I hear this directly from all kinds of businesses and investors. Canada is generally seen as a hostile place for doing business. High regulatory thresholds, very difficult jurisdictions to deal with, and we don't even have free trade within Canada. I mean, it's just bizarre. We've long missed the July 1 deadline where we wanted to have free trade in this country. So I mean, it's almost like there's a disconnect between government and elected officials who don't seem to listen to any of these. They don't see the numbers, I'm not sure, or where's the disconnect here that they don't understand that Canada is not seen as a place to do business.
Well, I think they do understand that. If they don't, then they got their head in their sand. But I think that the real issue that governments have to think about is how do you create an advantage that can allow you to encourage more investment in Canada and much more growth. And the reason I say that is that, just leaving aside, government policy for a moment, Canada is a cold climate, and that is a disadvantage, because you have to have more energy to heat your homes and heat your factories, et cetera, et cetera. And also, you also probably have more days lost due to climate and things like that. So that's a bit of a disadvantage. But the other significant disadvantage we have as a country is it's a relatively small population on a very large landmass. And most of that population lives near the U.S. border, along thousands of kilometers along the U.S. border. So we're very dispersed. And when you think of it, outside of the, let's say like the GTA in Ontario, which has, roughly 7 million people, and maybe some pockets like Montreal and then Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver, we have a lot of population that's living in kind of dispersed areas of the country. And so you don't have the same economies of scale and population size as you would find in a little country like Singapore, which has not a lot of area, but a very significant, a relatively large population for that area. So that's another disadvantage we have to deal with. Now, on the other hand, we have, as we started off today, we have a huge advantage in having all those resources that we can use. And so in some ways we should, as we started off, we should be a very rich economy. In fact, just to give an example, Argentina, back in the late 1800s, had the same per capita income as Canada, the same per capita GDP. And in fact, people thought that Argentina was going to be the rich country of the world by the end of the 1900s. What happened? Bad government management of the economy. They had socialism for many different countries. Many years they had dictatorships, etc. The Argentinians just did not do that well, and over the years they slipped behind more and more other countries, and certainly they slipped well behind Canada. We ended up continuing to grow, usually keeping up relatively to the U.S. until recently, and while Argentina kept slipping more and more relative to everybody else. And that's because they did not have good government managing it. We've had better government, and I think lately our concern is government working well in Canada? Are we getting the efficiency in government and the policy making that can really help grow the economy? And I think that's the concern that people have, because really we should be doing very well. We have a well-educated workforce. We have all these resources, and the question is why are we slipping? Do you know for the first time in the past couple of years, our per capita GDP is now less than the average of the OECD. That's remarkable when you start thinking.
That is remarkable. Wow.
We are slipping.
So we are, without putting words in your mouth, Dr. Mintz, it's like you're doing a kind of a checkup here, as you have gone to so many other countries with the World Bank and the IMF, helping out other nations turn the bend, so to speak. But as you look at Canada, are we a nation that is fundamentally broken?
I wouldn't say we're broken yet. I think we'll be broken if we start seeing parts of Canada looking to leave, as in the case of Quebec, where that almost happened in 1995. If that referendum, which had a very slim margin in favor of staying in Canada, went the other way, we would have a very interesting period after.
But let's talk about the state of our federation, because you've written about it extensively, Jack. You said in a recent, and I love your columns in the National Post, but on June 27, 2025, you said, "Is it any wonder that alienation and frustration simmer in the West? If colonialism is at its heart the subjugation of one region for the benefit of another, then Western Canada's predicament fits the definition all too well." What did you mean by that, Jack?
Gee, I always forget what I sometimes say, but anyway, that one I don't forget really. There is it reflects some thinking that I've had for a number of years. In fact, it goes back to a very early time when I was a young professor at Queen's University, and I wrote something at that time with a political science professor, a well-known person, Richard Simeon, who unfortunately passed away a number of years later.
Yes, I do recall him.
But I had this idea at that time, which we wrote up more formally, that there are two reasons why you can get countries breaking up. One of them is when there are differences in tastes across populations, where it's very hard for one population, if they want to have certain objectives and certain things that they want, that's different from the others, and so therefore they would like to be on their own because of those different tastes. And that could be a good example that there's a number of countries where you can think about that, but of course obviously a good example that is Quebec versus the rest of Canada. But there is another reason why countries can break up, and it's one besides conflict of taste, and another one is what I call conflict of claim, and that happens when a very small region of a country is looked upon in providing transfers to the rest of the region, the rest of the country. And the trouble is that if that one part is very rich, then you have to take a lot of money away from that small jurisdiction in order to have any meaningful impact on the rest of the country. And so I call that kind of conflict of claim. And I wrote another piece just 4 or 5 years ago. It's in the University of Calgary, in the University of Calgary School of Public Policy publication series, where I go through that in more detail. And I've also published a piece internationally on it. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. For example, people don't realize that one of the things that got Singapore to separate from Malaysia, partly was conflict of taste because there was a big difference between the Chinese that dominated Singapore and the Bumiputras that dominated Malaysia. But also Singapore was getting richer, and the Malaysians, were kind of jealous of all that, and that was being a smaller jurisdiction, and so they wanted to have a good chunk of that wealth themselves. And then, of course, we've seen this in Lombardy and in Italy. We've seen this happen in Spain with the Basque region, and even the breakup of Czechoslovakia into Czech Republic and Slovakia. One was rich, one was poor. And so you have lots of examples where this conflict of claim actually happens. And so that's a reason I raised that in that article, because when you look at Alberta, it's constantly supporting the rest of Canada. In fact, right now, it provides $20,000 again this year or last year. They've gone back to what it was before, and since 1965, there's been I forget the exact number, but I think it's around $800 million. It's been $1 billion. That's been, or 640
say billion.
It's been a big number. I remember that to the rest of Canada, and so Albertans are kind of like in that conflict of claim situation. So when they have the federal government that is basically elected by majorities out east, that is taking away, let's say, the livelihood of Albertans through regulations and taxation, then you can understand why there's this huge frustration where Alberta is being felt to be almost like a colony, being treated, by central Canada.
Well, and you can see it's not just Alberta, it's Saskatchewan and BC as well. As you have this massive transfer of money every year to the rest of the country, really to prop up other provinces that even have larger states than those other provinces. So,
Well,
we've got
actually,
some.
I should say, even though that's true about Saskatchewan, and BC has been kind of on and off over the years, but actually Alberta is exceptional. And in fact, the amount of that transfer is equal to almost 9% of the personal income of Albertans. In other words, it's almost like a 10% tax rate, that transfer.
That's incredible. So there's no mystery then as to why there's an undercurrent among many Albertans to want to consider separation in some form to be able to move forward, especially if you have a federal government that's constantly wanting to shut down and affect their key industry, which is oil and gas.
No, and that's exactly it. And I think that's really a huge tension. I think that still remains, and even after yesterday's budget, still remains between
So
Alberta.
is there a distinct risk that, and I know it's really a quote minority of parties in Alberta that are open to a separation option, but if that at some point became a majority and Alberta sought independence, um, what would be the future for the Federation of Canada?
Well, I wouldn't want to predict anything. In fact, I hate forecasting. But suppose that Alberta did become a separate nation and decided to be on its own, and basically the breakup did happen. I think what happens to the rest of Canada will depend very much on how they react to it. First of all, the Atlantic and Ontario and Quebec can basically move on as it did. The one thing it'll miss is all those transfers that come from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Let's see if Saskatchewan joined Alberta, and so that certainly would be a loss. But I think that could be dealt with, and I don't see that being a remarkably problematical in that sense. However, Quebec, if they see Alberta leaving, may decide, well, maybe it's about time we go, and so that you may get a domino effect, in that sense.
Exactly.
I think the provinces that would have the most difficulty would be British Columbia, which is sort of like Bangladesh and Pakistan when they broke up. They're they would be segregated from the rest of Canada, and even though they still have access to the Pacific Ocean, which is very important to them, the question is what kind of access are they going to have to the rest of Canada? And in fact, it may be that BC will have to work out a deal with Alberta, an independent Alberta, to allow Alberta to trade internationally through British Columbia, while British Columbia has the rights to move goods over to the rest of Canada. But
Exactly.
I think that's going to be a very complex area, and so you can see the potential breakup of Canada into maybe several regions if Alberta should trigger a separation.
Exactly. Well, it's almost a surreal conversation, but it's part of the risk profile of this country as we talk about the state of Canada. And of course, when we talk about the state of Canada, we can't help but talk about our key relationship with our friend and ally, the United States. Why don't we have a trade agreement at this point, Jack? Is there a simple answer to that?
Well, right now we do have a trade agreement. It's called the Canada-U.S.
Yes,
Mexican
correct.
Trade
Yeah,
Agreement,
that's
which is
right.
still there. And in
Indeed.
fact, we have 85% of our goods that are sold to Mexico that are tax-free or tariff-free. So that's been a very important deal right now, given what's been happening in the United States. On the other hand, I think the world has changed. I think one of the great unfortunate things is that when you go back to the 1980s and 90s, and even going into the first decade of this century, there was a pretty strong belief that markets really succeed in generating a high standard of living. And so it was very important for governments to impose regulations that are needed so the market can function properly, but at the same time not over-regulated and create barriers to investment and barriers to growth. Similarly, tax reform should be taken where there's much less taxation of capital, because basically, once people earn the income, they pay tax on that, and then when they save it, then they're paying more tax on their earnings. So there's an argument that we end up taxing investment and savings too heavily under an income tax. So therefore, we should be moving to consumption taxes, et cetera. So there's been that trend as well that a number of countries had accepted. And then you have also had other policies that people looked at basically to kind of get governments out of the way of markets and not trying to encourage them. And of course, free trade was very important, and the idea of moving towards zero tariffs, which has been happening ever since the Second World War. Their governments have been negotiating away tariffs on the argument that free trade is good. But then with the financial crisis in 2008, we started seeing really a different view of markets. There was anger towards the banks and a feeling of significant market failures, of governments not punishing what happened during the financial crisis, where financial institutions were making very bad mortgage loans to various people, and that they ended up creating a real economic problem for everyone, and a loss. And then you also had Occupy Wall Street and the concerns over inequality, as if inequality didn't exist in the previous decade. It all of a sudden became a major issue. And so and then you started getting criticism of trade. People saying that trade, China, because of its entry in the World Trade Organization, was using its state-owned enterprises, subsidized state-owned enterprises, to grab international market share. And so therefore, free trade has been actually led to this transfer of jobs to China and to other countries, low-wage countries, and it's hurt the heartland, the manufacturing heartland of many of the industrialized countries. And so therefore, free trade was not great, as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would have said, but rather that free trade was now a bad thing. And it's not surprising today that you have someone like Donald Trump coming along and saying, well, I'm going to start using tariff policy to try to, bring back manufacturing to the United States, not just for economic reasons, but for national security reasons.
Exactly. Yes.
And that free trade is a bad thing now.
Right.
And Trump really isn't the first to interfere with trade. That's been happening actually a lot amongst countries over the past decade, where they put in domestic requirements for procurement. They put in all sorts of other policies that would favor domestic production and try to limit trade. And of course, in Canada, amongst the provinces, they've been very sophisticated in trying to protect certain industries in their province. And so free trade has become almost a dirty word for not just politicians, but in countries. And so we should not be surprised about the tariffs that have come along recently. If you look at the United States, they look at tariffs really for three reasons. One is to draw this manufacturing sector back into the United States. The second is to try to correct the trade deficits. In fact, the argument being the United States being the reserve currency, their currency has been bid up too high, and that has made it more expensive to export, and they chronically have more imports coming into the country, and so that's one of the reasons they wanted to fix up their tariffs. And then the third reason, which has been a very important reason historically, is that tariffs provide revenue. And in fact, I was down in the United States for a conference in June in Washington, D.C. In fact, I was the only Canadian invited, so it was quite interesting to sit and listen to the Americans. And there were views on all sides with respect to the current policies that were being pursued by the Trump government in the United States. But the view of the people in the conference was, there could be some value to having tariffs. And in fact, I was asked a question: if you had a choice between raising the corporate tax, which the Democrats were pushing for during the Biden years, or using tariffs to fund the government, which is better? And if that's your comparison, I can make a very strong case that it's better to use tariffs rather than corporate taxes, because corporate taxes actually make it more expensive to export, and actually allows imports to be more competitive to come into the country. So you could argue that tariffs maybe is a better choice.
Exactly. And actually, that's a brilliant summation, Jack, at least from my perspective. It's almost like the Wall Street Journal, a kind of a traditional kind of old school globalist perspective, does not understand the urgency that this administration is pursuing both security, national security, to build certain industries. Like if you don't have a robust steel industry, you can't have the ability to build your armed forces. But it's also the concern about rebuilding the middle class and the working classes so that you can have a high functioning and high standard of living for everybody. And I think thirdly is the whole notion that the US can't afford to kind of wage endless wars and kind of act as a base to offer protection. They can't enable Canada to be a protectorate or any other ally, but they need actual partners or allies that carry their weight. So is that kind of a fair summation of kind of the dynamic that perhaps many decision makers in Canada don't seem to understand?
I think that might be the case. I mean, I think part of it is that in Canada we've always been an open economy, going back to Harold Innis and the staple theory.
Yes.
We trade furs and other products at that time in order to grow, and so trade has always been important to Canada, and I think probably that's one of the reasons why we've always been, I think, supportive of free trade, because it's been good for us as a country. I think the considerations that are in places like Europe and United States right now are somewhat different, although often trends in the United States do impact thinking in Canada. And so there are people who have raised similar concerns about trade, leading to national security issues and et cetera, et cetera. But let's face it, our national security issues are much different than when talking about the United States. The United States is the policeman for the world. It's it has a huge. It's hugely important to the Western alliance. In fact, one of the reasons why Canada has hardly spent any money on defense over the years since the 1960s is because we have the umbrella of the United States to protect us. And we know that they'll always do it anyway because they need to protect their own homeland. So I think it's kind of allowed us to kind of free ride on the United States so that we could pursue more economic interests, which has been through trade.
So just to wrap things up here, Jack, is there a risk that Canada, as it continues to decline, becomes like an Argentina? And ironically, we've got a Milei government that's been reelected. They are turning around big time in terms of their financial situation. Is that, frankly, a very important lesson that is right before us? Is the lesson of Argentina? Do we risk being an Argentina?
I hope not, and certainly we haven't
I
yet.
hope not.
But I think it would be a shame if that ever happened to Canada, that we became another Argentina. And I think it's going to be very important that we work together as a country in order to try to deal with the problems that we have. But in the end, I think a big part of our thinking, I think, has to be that actually the real growth is going to come from the people of Canada. Our standard of living is going to be something that Canadians will create. It's not an institution. It's not a corporation. It's not a university or an educational establishment that's going to do it. It's going to be people that are going to do it. And of course, the institutions reflect what people can achieve. And so I would like to see a much more entrepreneurial Canadian society in the long run that really gives the flexibility of people to pursue the kind of opportunities that they would like to achieve without restrictions on what they can achieve. And of course, that's the problem when you get into a central planning type situation. Governments don't have all the information to say what's the best thing to do. In fact, it's almost impossible. And then, of course, they also start throwing in, political decisions and priorities that have nothing to do with economic growth, and therefore start creating real significant barriers for entrepreneurs to succeed. And in today's mobile society, there's no reason why people have to stay here. They can go elsewhere. And especially that's a big concern when our young people start looking at leaving the country.
Well, Dr. Jack Mintz, I like the way you think, the way you've outlined both the risks, but also the incredible opportunities if we convince, frankly, our government to get out of the way and to free up, as you say, the potential that is our Canadian people. So thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Here at Frontier, we don't receive any government funding. We are nonpartisan and we work for you. Find out more and support this important work by visiting fcpp.org today.